we see a girl, Jane, lying on a mattress, and a man, Harry, watching her through a little window at the door. He closes the window and starts playing loud rock music, which wakes her up. Then we see a Professor Joseph giving lecture at Oxford University. He asks students questions about their beliefs and asks if anyone believes in ghosts. No one raises there. And he plays a video of a little boy named David, who was one of his patients. He says David was normal at first, but then everything changed, and we see David drawing a picture of what he calls Mr. Grego. The professor asks who is that. The chandelier falls and we hear glass breaking right after. They go downstairs and see the plate shattered in the ground. The video footage ends there. A student says it's unethical what he's doing when the professor was about to ask other questions. He starts arguing with other students, Christina and Harry. Joseph stops them and continues to talk. He shows them a picture of a girl. Jane says she's the next one. If you kill a patient, you kill the humanity. The class ends and we see Brian, the filmmaker, and we see the most of the film through his lens, talking with Joseph. He tells Brian that his job is to document everything happening in this experiment. They talk, shake hands, and agree to work together. We see Joseph talking with Jane through Brian's camera. She tells him that she sees someone, a little girl named Evie. She says they have to help her. A sound comes from the radiator right then and scares everyone. Then we see Harry coming out of Jane's room, blasting rock music again. Brian asks what's wrong with her, and Harry responds saying she's suicidal and doesn't remember a thing from her past. She was adopted and abandoned multiple times. Families kept her for a while, but then things started to happen, like furniture moving and burning, so they thought she was possessed. Then Joseph found her and diagnosed her with schizophrenia. He opens the little window, and Brian films inside. Then we see Bria talking to the professor, Joseph. He tells Brian to not look directly into Jane's eyes and not to tell her anything if he wants to help her. He can't let her get hurt because of external factors. Brian says okay and goes to her room with his camera. He starts to film her, and she turns around to him. Brian puts down his camera, looks at her in the eyes and talks with her. She first starts crying and then laughs. Brian gets freaked out. He gets out of the room and locks the door. He sees Joseph outside, waiting for him to get out. He tells him what Jane told him to tell Joseph. Brian says he's not sure if he can continue doing this, but Joseph convinces him to stay. Then we see them talking about the goal of the experiment. Then we see them giving Jane a small doll, and Joseph shows them the videos of his patient, David. The door knocks right then and they go to open it. Joseph sees the provost with police officers. We see them back in university, waiting for Joseph. He comes out angry and says they need to take Jane somewhere else because they stopped funding them. He turns around and asks that if they accept to continue with him, and they all agree. We see them moving into another house. Brian sets the camera in front of the house, and they all gather in front of it to pose. Then they get inside, and we see the car's door moving by itself. Then we see Brian filming Harry, who's explaining their tools and what they do with them. Joseph brings in Jane, and they start. Joseph says he wants to talk to Evie, but she doesn't talk to them. Then we see them installing things around the house, and Brian notices Jane looking upset. He then goes to her room with a flower and asks how she's feeling. Jane says she's a disappointment, and she should find Evie. Brian tries to comfort her. Then we see Joseph trying other ways with Jane. He starts directing and asking her questions. We hear screaming while he talks, and Joseph asks Jane why she didn't say Evie was there. He asks her to bring her back. Then we see them popping champagne to celebrate their progress in the next scene. Then we see Christina, Harry, and Brian in front of Jane's room. Harry and Christina go to a room to get intimate, and Brian goes to check Jane from the window and the door. He sees her in front of him. They make eye contact. She turns around, walks towards the middle of the room, and takes off her dress. The professor comes there, sees Brian in front of the window, and he looks inside. He then tells him to go get rest and that he can stay tonight. They hear Jane doing something upstairs the next day, and they go to check it. They get inside the room and see her ripping off the doll's hair. Christina gets the doll from her, and they try to talk to her. Harry shoves her doll into the camera, and something happens to his leg. Then we see Jane attacking Christina. They separate them, and Jane tells Brian it wasn't her, it was Evie who is inside her. Then she starts touching Brian, who tries to stop her, and Joseph comes in, telling her to get away from Brian. Brian gets out and tries to explain himself to Joseph, but he stops him, saying he knows. Then he tells him she knows his feelings towards her, and it might be dangerous for him. Jane keeps calling Brian behind the door. Then we see them around Jane, who's tied up to the machine again. They try to call Evie. Jane says there is fire, and it's too hot. Joseph says there isn't a fire, but Jane keeps saying that it's so hot. Joseph asks if Evie's scared of fire. Then he gets a candle and places it under Jane's arm. She doesn't feel anything at first, but then Brian tells him to stop when he starts to burn her arm, and Jane starts screaming. We see Brian looking at the films in the other small house in the backyard. He hears a sound and goes out to investigate it. He goes to the house and looks around. He comes in front of Jane's room and looks inside from the window, but he doesn't see her anywhere. He opens the door and gets in. He sees her face cut, covered in blood, and holds her right before she falls to the ground. He calls Christina for help. Then we see Christina and Joseph talking in the backyard the next day, while Brian watches them from afar. He sees Joseph pulling Christine to kiss her. We see Jane in a bathtub, playing with her doll while talking to Brian, who's filming her. Jane suddenly tries to get up, and Brian points the camera to somewhere else. Jane laughs at him and gets back into the tub. Brian tries to convince her to get out of there and get professional help, but Jane refuses, saying Joseph would be so sad about it. Brian tells her to forget about him, but Jane says he saved and protected her. Then we see them sitting around the table again, and Joseph starts asking questions about the fire. Jane starts describing it. She suddenly gets up, holds her doll, and says Evie is back. Brian gets up and gets his camera to film more closely. Jane says they can't leave, they are locked, and she's burning. Then smoke starts to come out of her hands. Joseph tells Christina to bring ice. Brian says she needs a doctor, but he refuses. They try to calm Jane while Brian continues to film behind them. Jane tilts her head back and something comes out of her mouth. It reaches towards Brian. Brian says she needs to rest. The professor asks Christina and Harry what they think. They say she needs to rest, so Joseph agrees. We see them playing in the backyard, and Brian goes to film Jane, who's playing with water while Joseph watches them. Then we see all of them back at the table again. Jane says she can't find Evie, and we hear a sound coming from upstairs. It keeps getting closer. Brian takes his camera to his hand to film better. Jane says she's here. Then the things start to act weird. Joseph asks what can they do to calm her down, and everything calms down. They hear another sound and get up to look for it. Joseph yells at Evie to let Jane go and tells Jane to repeat him. The door in front of them opens, and the professor goes to look inside. He opens the closet door more and sticks his head in to look round, but something pulls him inside. He starts yelling that it bit him. He manages to get out, and we see blood on his hand. Then we see Brian, who's watching the footage again, and he sees the part that the creature come out of her mouth is burned. Then we see him on the backyard, talking with Christina and Harry. He explains them the things happened might not be real at all. He gives reasons about every single thing that happened. He finally gets the doll, stabs it, and we hear Jane screaming. They rush to her room and see blood coming out of her mouth. Brian looks at them in shock while they try to help Jane. We see them making Jane lay down on another machine while she's hugging her doll. Brian holds out his hand, and Jane gives him the doll. Harry tells her to look at the ceiling and relax. They cover her with a black cloth. They start the machine, and we see the pictures that come out. Joseph explains and says that they are Jane's bioelectric energy fields. We see two different pictures, the one where she's normal, and the one when Evie comes out. They look at another picture and see Evie's face on it. Joseph shows it to Jane, and says that she created it and she can destroy it. Jane says she doesn't want to get rid of her. Joseph and Brian get shocked, and they say she can't be real. Then we see Joseph watching Jane from the window while she talks to the doll. Christina comes and starts talking to him. She starts touching him, but Joseph stops her and says they can't do it tonight. Christina goes away, but she sees Joseph entering Jane's room. She goes, looks from the window, and sees Joseph humming a song to Jane, who's laying on his knee. Then we see Christina looking out of the window while smoking, and Harry asks her what's wrong. She says that this place is a prison, and they are all prisoners there. She says Joseph is in love with Jane, and he tries to heal her so he can be with her. She argues with Harry and goes to leave the room. She touches the machine that used to get Jane's pictures, and she gets thrown to the wall. Her head starts bleeding, and they hear Jane laughing from the speaker. Jane tells Joseph that she has nothing to do with this and she can't control her. But Joseph says she created Evie and she can control her. Christina argues with Joseph and Harry supports Christina. Then we see Christina arguing with Harry in the bed. Harry reaches to kiss her, but the lights go out. We hear running noise and see Brian start to film. He runs into the house and sees Christina and Harry. They explain him what happened, and Joseph calls him from upstairs to bring light. He says that Jane is missing. They go upstairs and start following him. When they hear Jane's scream coming from upstairs, they rush upstairs to look for her. They reach a door and see that it's locked. Joseph tries to open it, but he can't. Then the door opens by itself, and they get inside. They hear Jane crying, start looking around to find her. Brian films around the rooms, and they say it looks like Jane's room. They finally find her, and Jane asks what are they doing there. She looks like she has no clue what's going on. Joseph asks where Evie is, and they notice something in the cradle. Jane says she's right in front of them and lifts up the cover on the bed. We see a burn trace that belongs to a baby. Jane starts talking to it as if it was Evie. She reaches out and touches it. A light comes out of it and goes to Jane's stomach. She starts screaming, and Christina tries to help her. They lift up her shirt and see a symbol carved on her body. We see Christina taking care of Jane's wound, and Brian asks Joseph what that was. He says it was a seal, a sign of worshipping the devil. He asks them which one of them told her about this, and Christina tells him to think about the possibility that Evie is not something that Jane created, but Joseph keeps blaming them. They all start arguing with him, and Joseph yells at them. Joseph asks Jane if she wants to continue, and she says yes. Joseph turns to them, says they can go if they are afraid, and Christina returns to Oxford with Harry. We see Brian talking with Jane, and she asks him to not lose hope on Joseph, Evie, and her. She says they need him and kisses Brian. She tries to kiss him again, but he stops her and says they can't do it, then he gets out of the room. We see Brian looking around in Joseph's room. He finds Jane's file and starts looking through it. He goes to Jane's room and tells her that he needs to go, but he will be back soon. She doesn't respond or looks at him. The professor comes and asks him where is he going, and Brian says he needs to buy more film for the camera. We see him back in Oxford, and we see Christina going into the bathtub. Brian goes to investigate the seal in library. He looks through books and collects information. We see Christina's bath water boiling. She notices and gets out of the tub. She runs to the door to open it but sees that it's locked. She starts hitting at the door and yells for Harry. She turns around and sees the creature, and Harry comes in. We see them arguing with Joseph when Brian comes back at the house. Brian shows them what he had found and starts telling them about Evie. He tells them the cult used her when she was a child, and she had a birthmark on her. He continues to tell what happened to Evie. The professor says that this makes no sense and starts laughing. They argue with him. Joseph then goes to Jane's room and starts asking her about this. She doesn't answer him, so he gets her up and shakes her while continuing to yell. Then he slaps her and Brian attacks him. Harry separates them. Joseph gives Christina and Harry an option to stay, but he tells Brian to leave after leaving the footage. Brian goes to Christina and Harry to ask for their help. He says he needs their car because he's planning to leave and take Jane with him. He gets their car and goes to home, but hears the voice of David's video. He goes to look and sees Jane watching it. The others join him too. They watch the full version of the videos and learn that Joseph is actually David's father. They watch the end and see David's dead body at the end. Joseph comes in and begs for Jane to trust him. Christina attacks him, and Harry starts fighting with him too. Brian tries to separate them while Jane keeps watching. Then they all start screaming, and we see that they all have the seal carved on their body now. Christina runs out, but she suddenly stops and something pulls up in the air. She gets thrown to upstairs. Harry and Brian runs upstairs. They hear her screams coming from Jane's room. Harry tries to open the door, but he can't. He reaches in from the window to open the door, but something pulls him inside from his arm. The thing pulls him one more time and kills him. Brian looks at the door, and it opens. He looks inside and sees Christina's dead body. Brian goes to Jane and sees her looking at Evie's picture. She starts talking and shows him her birthmark. Brian tries to talk to her, but she grabs him by the throat and starts choking him. Joseph comes in right then and injects her, saving Brian. Then he hits Brian's head and makes him pass out too. We see Brian tied to the chair and Jane lying at the table where they took her picture. Joseph tries to film himself. Brian wakes up and yells him to stop, but Joseph asks Jane to let Evie out one last time. Jane accepts it while Brian keeps screaming him to not do it. Joseph starts the process, and Brian frees himself. He starts fighting with Joseph, and he hits him. Brian runs to Jane and makes her wake up. He says it's going to be okay, but Jane apologizes and he gets thrown out of the room. The door closes, and Brian tries to open it. He yells at Jane to open it while they make eye contact, but she doesn't. Jane starts to burn while Brian still tries to open the door, but the whole room bursts into fire. Then we see Brian getting filmed, sitting at a table in a mental hospital. The doctor asks him questions. He says everything is in the camera, but the doctor says all of the film is destroyed. Brian starts hitting the camera on the table while yelling, and they rush to stop him. The doctor accuses of him of being a murderer and keeps asking him questions. Brian points at his hand and smoke starts to come out of it. He turns to the camera, claps his hands, and the movie ends.